My name is Meadow Rosaline Whitaker. I'm 34 years old, and until recently, I was someone most people would describe as steady. Not exciting, not loud, not dramatic, just steady. I live, or lived, in Seattle. I was the kind of woman who remembered birthdays without reminders, who refilled the Brita before anyone else noticed it was empty, who could tell by the sound of a closing door what mood my husband was in. I worked part-time from home as a freelance editor. The rest of my time went into what people casually call support. Supporting his schedule, supporting his career, supporting his stress. From the outside, I looked comfortable, safe, even luckier. But there's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't look like suffering. It looks like competence. When you are always calm, always reasonable, always the one who smooths things over, people begin to assume you will always stay, that you can absorb more, that you don't have a breaking point because you never raise your voice. My husband once said, half laughing, half certain, "You'd never leave. You don't even know how to be on your own." He didn't say it cruelly. That's the important part. He said it the way someone states a fact about the weather, as if it were obvious, as if it were permanent. This is not a story about revenge. There are no screaming matches, no shattered glass, no dramatic confrontations in the rain. This is a story about quiet shifts, about the slow accumulation of small dismissals that don't look like wounds until you line them up side by side. It's about what happens when silence stops being survival and starts becoming strategy. It's about the day I realized that staying calm did not mean staying small. My husband said I'd never leave. I moved out while he was on vacation. And when he came home, he walked into a bedroom where my closet was empty and a single envelope rested on the kitchen counter. Inside was a lawyer's letter. What happened between those two moments, the comment he thought I'd forget, and the silence he never saw coming, is what I'm going to tell you. Slowly, honestly, without embellishment. Because the most powerful exits are rarely loud. Have you ever been so underestimated that people mistook your patience for permanence? Before I became the woman who left quietly, I was the woman who stayed reliably. To my husband, Daniel, I was the calm one, the balanced one. The reasonable voice was heard when things at his tech firm became volatile. He admired that about me. At least that's what he said. He'd introduce me at company dinners with a fond half smile and say, "Meadow keeps me grounded. I don't know what I'd do without her." People would laugh, I would smile. What no one noticed was that being ground means being walked on. In social settings, I was the listener. The one who asked thoughtful follow-up questions while others competed to tell better stories. Daniel filled rooms effortlessly. He was articulate, quick-witted, and confident in a way that made people lean forward. I stood beside him in soft colours, nodding at the right moments. I knew when to laugh. I knew when to place a light hand on his arm to signal it was time to wrap up a story. I was not invisible. That's the strange part. I was visible as an accessory. At family gatherings, I became the efficient one. Daniel's mother would hand me serving spoons before she handed me wine. "You're so good at organising, Meadow," she'd say, meaning you're dependable, predictable, non-threatening. When career conversations happened, mine were summarised in a sentence. "She edits from home. It works as well for them. For us." My flexibility was framed as convenience. My ambition, quiet, internal, carefully tended, was treated as optional, temporary, something I'd outgrow. Even Daniel believed this, though I don't think he realised it. He'd say things like, "When we have kids, you'll probably want to focus on that anyway." Not a question, a projection, a future already drafted without my input. And because I was conflict-averse, not weak, just raised to keep peace, I rarely corrected him in the moment. I would think, "This isn't worth it. He doesn't mean harm. It's just easier this way." Easier became my default setting. At home, I managed our finances with meticulous care. I tracked investments, renegotiated insurance rates, and optimized subscriptions. Daniel would joke to friends, "She's the CFO of the house." He never asked how much mental load that required. He never saw the spreadsheets open at midnight, the research tabs, the way I quietly ensured we were always secure. Security, ironically, became my private teacher. I learned how assets were structured. I learned what was in my name and what wasn't. I learned the timelines, the clauses, and the legal language. Not because I was planning an exit, at least not at first. I told myself I was simply being responsible. To his colleagues, I was supportive. To his family, I was helpful. To our friends, I was stable. To Daniel, I was constant. Constant is comforting until it becomes assumed. There's a subtle difference between being loved and being relied upon. One warms you, the other consumes you. I don't think Daniel ever intended to reduce me, but he grew used to my elasticity. If he worked late, I adjusted dinner. If he cancelled plans, I reassured friends. If he forgot an anniversary detail, I smoothed it over so no one felt awkward. My emotional range became compressed. Calm, understanding, low maintenance. He once told a friend in front of me, "Meadow doesn't really need much, she's just steady." And I nodded, because I had trained them to believe that. The truth is, I needed depth, partnership, recognition that quiet does not equal empty, that patience does not equal a lack of options. But when you spend years being the reasonable one, you start to question whether your dissatisfaction is simply ingratitude. We had a beautiful apartment, financial comfort, no overt cruelty, no scandals, no chaos, just a slow erosion of definition. I wasn't unhappy in a dramatic way. I was dissolving in a subtle one. And dissolving is hard to explain, especially when everyone around you insists you're lucky. So I stayed steady. And they stayed certain that I would always be there, certain that I would always absorb, certain that I would never leave. It didn't begin with shouting, it began with laughter. We were at a rooftop gathering hosted by one of Daniel's co-workers, the kind of evening where string lights soften sharp personalities and everyone holds a drink they don't actually want. Conversations drifted between stock options and ski trips. I remember the wind that night, how it tugged at the hem of my dress and made me hold my glass a little tighter. Someone asked how Daniel and I met. He told the story the way he always did, except this time he added something new. "I almost didn't pursue her," he said lightly, smiling at the group. "She was so quiet. I figured she wouldn't last in my world." The group chuckled. It wasn't cruel laughter, just social laughter. "And now?" someone teased. Daniel shrugged. "Now she keeps things running so I can focus on the big stuff." More laughter, a few approving nods. I smiled, because that's what you do in moments that are too small to protest, but too sharp to ignore. On the surface, it sounded like praise. I keep things running. I'm reliable, efficient. But there was something embedded inside it. A hierarchy. His world, the big stuff. My role is in infrastructure. I felt the cut then. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a thin, precise line across something tender. Later that night, in the car, I considered mentioning it. I imagined saying, "When you say it like that, it sounds like my life revolves around yours." I rehearsed it in my head, calm and measured. But Daniel was energized from the evening, talking about a new opportunity, a possible promotion. His excitement filled the car. I told myself, this isn't the right moment. That phrase became a habit. The next small cut came weeks later. We were reviewing our investment portfolio at the kitchen table. I'd spent hours researching a reallocation strategy that would diversify risk in case his company's stock dipped. I explained it carefully. Daniel skimmed the numbers, then leaned back in his chair. "You worry too much," he said, almost affectionately. "I've got this. My bonus alone covers any risk." I tried again. "It's not about the bonus, it's about exposure," he interrupted gently. "Meadow, relax. You don't need to micromanage everything." Micromanage. The word lingered. This was the same man who proudly called me the CFO of the house. The same spreadsheets he boasted about to friends were now evidence of anxiety. I closed my laptop. "Okay," I said. "What I didn't say was, this is how we stay secure. This is how we avoid dependency. This is how I make sure I can stand on my own if I ever have to." But at that time, the idea of standing alone still felt theoretical, hypothetical, like reading about earthquakes while living on stable ground. The third cut was smaller, almost invisible. We were at dinner with his parents when his mother asked about future plans. Children, a bigger house, maybe moving closer to them. Daniel answered before I could. "Well, Meadow's flexible. She can work from anywhere, so it makes sense to prioritize my location." Flexible. Again. No one looked at me to confirm. And I, true to pattern, didn't correct him. That night, brushing my teeth, I studied my reflection. Not searching for beauty or flaws, just presence. Who was I becoming in these conversations? The woman who nods? The woman who adjusts? The woman whose desires are assumed rather than asked? None of these moments was catastrophic. That's what made them powerful. They were deniable. If I had confronted him, he could have easily said, "You're overthinking it." And maybe I was. But something inside me had started cataloguing. Not angrily, not vindictively, just accurately. The laughter on the rooftop, the word micromanage, the casual future drafted without me. Each moment was small enough to dismiss. Together, they began to form a pattern. And patterns are harder to ignore than incidents. I didn't change after that rooftop night, but I started paying attention. And attention, when sustained long enough, becomes awareness. There's a moment when something stops feeling unusual and starts feeling normal. That shift is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It simply settles in. After the rooftop comment, after the investment dismissal, I began noticing how often my voice entered a room softly and left unheard. It wasn't that Daniel silenced me. He didn't tell me to stop speaking. He just moved past what I said, like someone scrolling past a notification they assume isn't urgent. At dinner one evening, I suggested we revisit our 5-year plan. His company had announced internal restructuring. I had read the memo twice. "It might be smart to explore options outside your current team," I said, just in case. Daniel didn't look up from his phone. "You're thinking worst case again?" "I'm thinking prepared," I replied gently. He exhaled, not irritated, just dismissive. "You don't need to carry all that stress. That's my lane." My lane. I swallowed the instinct to push back. Over time, I began editing myself before I spoke, trimming ideas down to essentials, waiting for the right opening. Sometimes the opening never came. When friends came over, I hosted effortlessly. I anticipated dietary restrictions, arranged seating so conversations flowed, and refilled drinks without interrupting stories. Daniel would later say, "See, you're amazing at this. You don't even try." But I did try. I tried to be seamless. And seamlessness is invisible by design. The most subtle normalization happened in tone. Daniel developed a habit of explaining things to me that I already understood. Not arrogantly, not maliciously, just automatically. If I asked about his workday, he'd begin with, "So basically, what happened is," as if translating complexity for someone outside his intellectual range. I have a degree in economics. I've built freelance contracts from scratch. I've negotiated rates, managed clients, and structured budgets. But inside our marriage, my competence softened into something smaller. One afternoon, I corrected a minor miscalculation in our tax estimate. He blinked, surprised. "Oh," he said, "I didn't realize you knew that." I smiled. "I do our taxes every year." He laughed lightly. "Right, basta." Of course, that phrase, meant to smooth over the oversight, landed strangely, as if my contributions existed in the background, unexamined until needed. I began rationalizing his behavior the way I'd been trained to. "He's stressed. He doesn't mean it that way. You're too sensitive. It's not that serious." And individually, none of it was. But the accumulation began to shift something inside me. I noticed I stopped sharing certain thoughts. I stopped mentioning articles I'd read. I stopped suggesting long-term strategies unless he explicitly asked. My world shrank to what was immediately useful. And because I rarely complained, Daniel assumed everything was fine. One night, while folding laundry, he walked into the bedroom and said casually, "I don't know how other guys deal with high-maintenance wives. You're so easy." Easy! I paused mid-fold. He meant it as a compliment. But ease, in our marriage, had started to mean absence of friction. Absence of demand, absence of insistence on being fully seen. I had trained him to expect no resistance, not because I lacked strength, but because I valued harmony. The problem with harmony is that it can mask imbalance, and an imbalance left unaddressed becomes structure. I began to understand something uncomfortable. I had participated in this dynamic. My silence wasn't forced, it was chosen repeatedly, in small moments to avoid conflict. But every time I chose quiet over clarity, I reinforced the role he unconsciously assigned me. Supportive, flexible, steady. Predictable. There's a difference between being peaceful and being passive. I had crossed that line without realizing it. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I didn't confront him. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't change my tone. But inside, something recalibrated. Respect, I realized, isn't lost in explosions. It erodes in allowances, and I had allowed more than I admitted. The realization didn't arrive as anger. It arrived as clarity. One Sunday morning, Daniel and I were having coffee by the window. It was raining. Seattle rain, soft and persistent, the kind that feels less like weather and more like atmosphere. He was reviewing emails. I was writing in my planner, mapping out the week. He glanced at me and said, almost affectionately, I don't know what I'd do without you organizing everything. You're the backbone of this house. Backbone? It sounded strong, foundational, essential. But backbones don't get consulted about direction. They support. They don't steer. And in that moment, I saw the pattern fully formed. I wasn't his partner in vision. I was his stabilizer, his risk absorber, his emotional regulator, the one who made sure nothing fell apart while he chased expansion. At dinner with friends later that week, the dynamic crystallized even further. One of the wives was discussing a new business she'd started. It wasn't massive, but it was hers. There was pride in her voice. Daniel squeezed my knee lightly under the table and said, smiling, Meadow's not really into the whole ambitious career thing. She prefers a slower life. Everyone nodded, satisfied with the explanation. I felt heat rise, not humiliation, not fury, just a quiet correction forming inside me. He believed that, because I had never challenged the narrative. The role assigned to me wasn't villainous. It was comfortable, reliable, non-threatening. I was the soft place to land, the calm in the chaos, the woman who didn't complicate his trajectory. And for a long time, I had worn that role willingly. There is something deeply validating about being needed. But being needed is not the same as being known. I began to ask myself questions I had avoided. When did I last articulate a personal goal without filtering it through his convenience? When did I last make a decision that centered my growth rather than our balance? When did I last risk being misunderstood? The answers were uncomfortable. The truth is, the role I played had benefits. It earned appreciation. It avoided conflict. It maintained peace. But it also made me smaller. Not visibly, not dramatically. Internally, I noticed how often conversations defaulted to his calendar. His deadlines, his stress, even vacations were planned around what would best recharge him. When I mentioned wanting to take a certification course to expand my freelance business, he responded kindly but vaguely. That's great, babe, if you have time. If you have time. As if my time were elastic, as if it expanded and contracted around his priorities. I didn't argue. Instead, I started observing with precision. Who initiates decisions? Who compromises more often? Whose ambitions are treated as inevitable and whose are optional? The answers were consistent. And once I saw the structure clearly, I understood something critical. He wasn't consciously diminishing me. He was operating inside a dynamic that rewarded him for doing so. I had made life efficient for him. Frictionless, stable. Why would he question a system that works so well for him? The deeper realization was this. Roles persist when they are never renegotiated. And I had never renegotiated mine. That Sunday morning, with the rain tapping against the glass, I looked at my reflection in the darkened window. Daniel was talking about a potential leadership opportunity. His voice carried confidence, certainty. I felt something new inside me. Not resentment, not rebellion. Just a quiet refusal to continue being defined by what made him comfortable. For the first time, I considered the possibility that the role I had been assigned was not permanent. And if roles can be assigned, they can also be stepped out of. But stepping out doesn't begin with confrontation. It begins with internal repositioning. And mine had just started. The shift didn't happen during a fight. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in complete silence. Daniel had left early for a week-long conference in Barcelona. It was a big deal. Panels, networking dinners, private investor meetings. He was energized in the way he always was before travel, slightly distracted, already half somewhere else. Before he left, he kissed my forehead and said, "Try not to miss me too much." I smiled. "Have a good flight, After the car pulled away, the apartment felt unusually still. Not empty, just unobserved. There is a difference. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen counter with my leather planner open in front of me. The afternoon light was pale and diffused, filtered through the clouds. And for the first time in a long while, there was no one else's schedule pressing against mine. No dinner to time, no energy to regulate, no subtle monitoring of tone or mood. Just quiet. I expected loneliness. Instead, I felt space. I don't know what prompted it, but I turned to a blank page in my planner and wrote a simple question at the top. If nothing were assumed about me, what would I choose? I stared at it longer than I expected to. The answers didn't come dramatically. They arrived carefully. I would expand my business beyond part-time. I would complete the financial certification I'd postponed. I would make decisions without pre-clearing them emotionally. I would live somewhere with more natural light. I would speak without trimming. The list surprised me. Not because it was radical, but because it was specific. None of it required permission. That realization landed differently than I anticipated. I didn't need to fight for these things. I only needed to stop shrinking them. Later that evening, I opened our shared financial dashboard. I reviewed our accounts, not anxiously, not suspiciously, just factually. I examined the structure of ownership, the joint assets, and the individual allocations. And for the first time, I didn't review them as a supportive spouse. I reviewed them as an autonomous adult. There was a subtle shift in perspective, not adversarial, just independent. I noticed how much of our long-term security had been built through my diligence. I diversified the investments, the risks I mitigated, the negotiations I handled quietly. Security had always been my language of love. Now it has become something else. Language of capacity. That night, I slept deeply. No dramatic revelation, no tears. Just a growing awareness that my life did not have to orbit someone else's trajectory. Midweek, Daniel called from Barcelona. He sounded exhilarated. "Babe, this trip is next level," he said. "I'm telling you, we're about to move up." I listened. I asked questions. I celebrated his wins. And while he spoke about future expansions, new roles, bigger responsibilities, I realized something profound. His world was accelerating. Mine had been paused, not by him alone, by me. When we hung up, I walked through the apartment slowly. I looked at the furniture we chose together, the art he liked. The layout is optimized for his work-from-home days. It struck me gently. I had built a life that functioned beautifully, but I had not built one that felt mine entirely. The shift wasn't anger. It was alignment. For the first time, I considered, not emotionally but practically, what my life would look like if it were designed around my growth. The thought didn't scare me. That was the real turning point. Because when the idea of independence stops feeling threatening and starts feeling possible, something fundamental changes. I didn't make any decisions that week. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't pack a box. But the internal narrative shifted from, "I would never leave a..." to, "I could." And once you know you could, the power dynamic quietly rearranges itself. He didn't feel it from Barcelona, but something irreversible had begun. When Daniel returned from Barcelona, he brought stories. He brought new business cards, a tailored jacket he hadn't told me he bought, and a heightened sense of momentum. His energy filled the apartment the way it always did after travel. Charged, forward-facing, ambitious. I listened. But something inside me had recalibrated. Before, my silence had been reflexive. I stayed quiet to keep things smooth, to avoid unnecessary friction. Now, my silence was deliberate, observational, almost clinical. He didn't notice the difference. At dinner that first night home, he spoke at length about a senior partner who had taken an interest in him. "This could change everything," he said. "We might have to consider relocating in a year or two." "We might." I set my fork down carefully. "Relocating where?" "New York, maybe London, sir." "Be London? Depends, but it would be huge." "And what would that mean for me?" I asked calmly. He smiled in a way that suggested reassurance. "You'd adapt. You always do." There it was again. Flexible, adaptable, seamless. In the past, I would have softened. I would have nodded and said, "We'll figure it out." This time, I just held his gaze for a second longer than usual. "Maybe," I said. The conversation moved on. But internally, something solidified. Silence, when chosen, is powerful. It forces the other person to sit with their assumptions unchallenged. It allows you to observe without revealing your recalculations. Over the next few weeks, I made small adjustments. I stopped preemptively solving his stress. If he vented about work, I listened, but I didn't immediately strategize solutions unless he asked. I stopped volunteering updates about household logistics unless they directly involved him. I resumed researching my certification course. Quietly, methodically. Daniel interpreted my restraint as calm support. "You've been so chill lately," he said one evening. "I appreciate that. No pressure." No pressure. He mistook my internal detachment for peace. That was the shift. For years, my emotional labor had been constant and invisible. Now, I redirected that energy inward. I tracked my own goals. I built timelines that did not center on him. I began transferring a portion of my freelance income into a separate savings account. Legally, transparently, but privately managed, not secretly, not deceitfully, just independently. When I reviewed our joint investments, I ensured my contributions were clearly documented. I organized records, updated passwords, archived statements. Not as preparation for confrontation, as preparation for clarity. One afternoon, Daniel came home frustrated. A proposal had been rejected. Normally, I would have adjusted the evening, dimmed the lights, ordered his favorite takeout, absorbed the tension. Instead, I continued cooking as planned. He watched me for a moment. "You're not going to ask what happened," he said. "You'll tell me if you want to," I replied gently. He did, but he also noticed something subtle. I was not regulating his mood for him. I was present, but I was not managing. That distinction unsettled him slightly, though he couldn't articulate why. He began seeking reassurance in small ways. "You're good, right?" he asked once, casually. "I'm good," I answered truthfully. And I was, because my silence was no longer suppression. It was positioning. The more I stepped back emotionally, the more I saw the architecture of our marriage clearly. The assumptions, the dependencies, the unspoken contracts. He still believed I would never leave. He still believed my steadiness equaled permanence. And I let him, not to deceive, but because for the first time, I was no longer reacting inside the role he assigned me. I was evaluating whether that role deserved my continued participation. Silence when rooted in fear shrinks you. Silence when rooted in awareness expands you. And I was expanding. He didn't see it yet. But I was no longer the woman who absorbed everything automatically. I was the woman deciding what I would carry and what I would set down. Preparation does not look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That was the advantage. Daniel moved through his weeks assuming equilibrium. He saw a calm wife, a stable home, no arguments, no ultimatums. If anything, I seemed more composed than ever. He didn't notice the precision behind that composure. The first thing I did was informational, not emotional. I scheduled a consultation with a family law attorney, not because I had decided to leave, but because I wanted to understand reality instead of assumptions. I booked it under the guise of a freelance meeting and went on a Wednesday afternoon. The attorney was direct. No theatrics. She walked me through asset division laws in Washington state, what constituted marital property, and what documentation mattered. She asked careful questions. "Are you planning to file?" she said. "I'm planning to understand." I replied. "Knowledge is stabilizing. It removes fantasy, both hopeful and fearful." I left with a checklist, not a battle plan, a clarity plan. Over the next month, I gathered documents quietly. Tax returns, investment statements, property records. I scanned everything into encrypted folders, not hidden, just organized in a way that did not rely on shared access. At home, nothing changed visibly. I still cooked dinner, still attended work events, still asked about his day. But internally, I shifted from emotional participant to strategic observer. I began tracking patterns more carefully. How often were major decisions presented as fates accompli? How often was my flexibility assumed rather than negotiated? How often did I minimize myself to maintain flow? The answers were consistent. I also expanded my freelance work deliberately. I reached out to former clients. I increased my rates incrementally. I accepted projects that required more responsibility. I enrolled in the certification course and paid for it from my independent account. When Daniel noticed the coursework materials on my desk, he smiled. "Look at you," he said. Keeping busy. Keeping busy. Not building. Not expanding. Busy. I didn't correct him. Instead, I focused on measurable outcomes. Within 3 months, my income had increased by 30%. Not explosive, but sustainable. I also reviewed our lease agreement carefully. It was set to renew in 6 months. Both our names were on it. I noted the clauses. I noted the notice period required. Preparation is not fueled by anger. Anger is impulsive. Preparation is patient. There were nights I lay awake questioning myself. Was I overreacting? Was this dynamic truly imbalanced or simply imperfect? But every time Daniel made a decision without consulting me about travel, about finances, about future possibilities, I felt the same quiet confirmation. The issue wasn't cruelty. It was an assumption. He assumed I would always adapt, always support, always remain. And I began constructing a life that did not require his assumption. One evening, at a dinner party, a colleague's wife asked me privately, "Do you ever feel like we just orbit their careers?" She laughed when she said it, lightly. I held her gaze. "Sometimes," I answered. She nodded, as if that was the only acceptable depth for the topic. But I didn't laugh, because I was no longer orbiting. I was calculating the trajectory. The final step in my preparation was emotional detachment. Not coldness, not withdrawal, but clarity. I stopped seeking validation from him. I stopped hoping he would spontaneously recognize the imbalance. I accepted that he operated comfortably within the structure we had built, and that structure did not fully honor me. Acceptance is powerful. It removes the need to argue. It replaces pleading with planning. By the time Daniel began discussing another upcoming international trip, this one a 10-day investor tour, I had already outlined multiple scenarios in my planner. Not fantasies, options. He believed everything was stable. He believed my quiet meant contentment. What he never noticed was that my calm had shifted from accommodation to alignment. And once alignment begins, movement follows. Quietly, methodically. I was no longer asking whether I could leave. I was determining how. Leverage rarely announces itself. It reveals itself when you stop looking for validation and start looking at facts. The private reveal didn't happen in a dramatic moment. It happened at my desk on an ordinary Thursday morning, sunlight angled across spreadsheets and legal notes. Daniel had forwarded me a compensation update from his firm, excited, triumphant. A significant portion of his projected earnings over the next 2 years would be tied to performance-based stock vesting. It was an impressive number. It was also conditional, and structured in a way that depended heavily on continuity. I read the documents carefully, twice. Then I opened our asset breakdown again. Here's what I saw clearly for the first time. A large percentage of our current liquidity exists because of the diversification strategies I had implemented over the past 4 years. Stable funds, balanced allocations, low-risk buffers. The performance-based stock. High upside, high exposure. If markets shifted, or if employment shifted, the structure changed dramatically. Daniel viewed his trajectory as linear, upward, expanding. But financial systems are not emotional. They are conditional. I scheduled a second conversation with the attorney, this time more specific. "What happens," I asked calmly, "if separation occurs before certain assets vest?" She answered without judgment, without suggestion, just information. The answer altered the landscape. The majority of our stable, secured assets were already documented as jointly held. Contributions traceable, timelines clear. The high-risk future gains, not yet materialized. For the first time, I understood something profound. My strength wasn't hidden potential. It was a documented contribution. I wasn't dependent. I had built half the foundation. That realization didn't make me triumphant. It made me steady. I drove home that afternoon feeling unusually grounded. Not vindicated, not victorious. Clear! When Daniel called that evening from work, talking rapidly about the upcoming investor tour, I listened with the same calm tone he expected. "They're flying us to Lisbon first," he said. "This trip is strategic. It positions us for long-term expansion." US. He still spoke in shared language about a future he was individually shaping. I realized then that our divergence wasn't about money. It was about authorship. He believed he was writing our future. I had been editing footnotes. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my planner open. I wrote 3 columns: stay and renegotiate, stay and accept, leave with dignity. Under each, I listed outcomes: emotional, financial, practical. Renegotiation required confrontation and willingness from both sides. Acceptance required shrinking. Leaving required courage, not rage, not drama, courage. I asked myself one final question. If nothing changes, can I respect myself in 5 years? The answer came quietly. No. That was the private reveal. Not that I could leave, but that staying would cost more than leaving. Daniel's upcoming trip stretched 10 days. International, time zone gap significant, communication sporadic. An opportunity, not for revenge, for execution. I closed the planner gently. My pulse was steady. My breathing is even. No tears, no shaking hands. Just alignment between what I knew and what I would do. The decision hadn't been announced, but internally it had been made. And once a decision settles without chaos, without panic, it becomes inevitable. He still believed I was steady. He was right. I was, just not in the way he thought. People imagine that leaving happens in a surge of emotion. It doesn't. It happens in a moment of stillness when the noise finally stops. Daniel's investor tour was scheduled for early spring. Lisbon first, then Madrid, then a series of private meetings in Zurich. 10 days, flights already booked, calendar blocked. The apartment felt calm the week before he left. Normal, even. We had dinner together. We watched a show. We discussed logistics. "Can you water the plants while I'm gone?" he asked casually. "Of course," I said. That word, of course, used to mean devotion. Now it meant neutrality. The night before his departure, he repeated the phrase that had once felt harmless. "You'd never leave me," he said, half smiling as he zipped his suitcase. "You're too steady for that." It wasn't a threat, it wasn't a test. It was certain. I met his eyes. "You seem very sure of that," I replied. He laughed. "I know you." The truth is, he knew the version of me that survived by adapting. He didn't know the version that had stopped negotiating with herself. After he left for the airport the next morning, I stood in the doorway for a long moment, listening to the echo of the elevator descending. Then I sat down at the kitchen table with my planner. This was the decision point. Not whether to leave. How? I reviewed my options one final time. Option 1. Wait until he returns. Initiate a calm conversation. Attempt renegotiation. Risk emotional persuasion, promises of change, and temporary adjustments. Option 2. File quietly while he was away. Inform him directly. Manage the logistics together. Controlled but confrontational. Option 3. Remove myself entirely. Relocate. Leave documentation in place. No spectacle, no scene. Irreversible. I examined my own emotional state carefully. Was I acting from hurt? From ego? From impulse? No. I felt composed, clear, grounded. I thought about 5 years from now. In 5 years, would I regret leaving with dignity? Or regret staying because I feared disruption? The answer was consistent. The only irreversible choice was the honest one. That afternoon, I signed a short-term lease for a smaller apartment across the city. Light-filled, minimal, mine. I scheduled movers for 3 days after his departure. Midweek, during business hours. Discreet, efficient. I transferred my independent savings to cover deposits and initial expenses. I informed my attorney that I would proceed with filing. Papers drafted, timeline confirmed. There was no surge of adrenaline, only focus. That evening, Daniel texted from Lisbon. "Landed. This city is unreal. You'd love it." I stared at the message for a moment. Maybe I would, but not as an accessory to his ambition. I replied, "Glad you arrived safely. Have a great search, zombies." Great first meeting. No hint, no hostility. Just calm. The decision was not about punishing him. It was about ending a role that no longer fit. When people talk about irreversible choices, they often imagine flames. Mine felt like closing a door gently behind me. The next step required precision and silence. Because once I moved, there would be no return to ambiguity. He would come home to an absence he never anticipated. And I would already be somewhere new. Not angry. Not running. Just gone. Execution is not emotional. No. It is logistical. 3 days after Daniel's flight to Lisbon, I woke up at 6 a.m. The apartment was still dim, the sky barely lightening over Seattle's skyline. I made coffee the same way I always did. Measured, unhurried. If anyone had looked at me that morning, they would have seen routine. At 8 a.m., the movers arrived. I had already packed in phases over the previous 2 days. Only my belongings, clothing, personal files, books I had purchased, the framed photograph of my grandmother, the slim leather planner, my laptop, my desk chair. I did not take shared furniture. I did not take the kitchenware we chose together. I did not strip the apartment bare. I removed myself. The closet was the most symbolic part. Half of it emptied with surprising efficiency. Dresses he had once complimented. Sweaters I wore to his company dinners. Shoes were purchased for events centered around his calendar. Box by box, the visual evidence of my presence diminished. There was no soundtrack, no dramatic pauses, just tape-sealing cardboard. By noon, the apartment looked almost unchanged, unless you knew where to look. My side of the closet, empty. My desk, cleared. Bathroom cabinet, half vacant. I walked through each room slowly, checking drawers, ensuring I had left nothing that belonged to me. Not out of spite, out of closure. At 1:30 p.m., I met my attorney at her office to sign the finalized documents, petition filed electronically that afternoon. She reviewed the details one last time. "Are you certain?" she asked, not skeptically, professionally. "Yes," I said. My voice did not shake. Back at the apartment, I placed a single envelope on the kitchen counter, neatly centered. His name is written in my handwriting. Inside was the formal notice from my attorney, outlining the filing and next steps. Clear, direct, respectful. No personal letter. No accusations. Anything I needed to say would be said later, if necessary. At 4 p.m., I handed the keys to the property manager, having arranged my name's removal from the lease, effective immediately under legal advisement. By early evening, I was standing in my new apartment. It was smaller, quieter. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, touching bare floors. My furniture, minimal and deliberate, sat in clean lines against white walls. There was no history here, no shared assumptions embedded in the corners. I set my planner on the kitchen counter and exhaled. Daniel texted around 10 p.m., his time zone ahead. Today was insane. Big conversations. Can't wait to tell you everything. I stared at the message. There was an almost surreal calm in knowing he was narrating a future I was no longer part of. I replied, as always. Glad it's going well. He sent a heart emoji. That was the last normal exchange. The next communication he received would not be from me. It would be from a law firm. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about alignment between decision and action. By the time Daniel boarded his return flight 10 days later, my life was structurally separate. Utilities transferred, mailing address updated, income rerouted, legal process initiated. There was nothing impulsive left to undo. When he unlocked the apartment door, he would not walk into chaos. He would walk into clarity, an empty closet, a quiet kitchen, and an envelope that explained what he never believed possible. He said I'd never leave. He was about to understand the cost of certainty. Daniel landed on a grey Sunday afternoon. I know this because I received the automated notification from the airline app, still synced to our shared calendar. Old habits of organisation linger, even when lives separate. He texted when he touched down. Just landed! Can't wait to be home. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, because there was nothing left to narrate. I imagined the sequence clearly. He would have taken a rideshare from the airport, checked emails on the way, maybe even rehearsed the stories he planned to tell me. Lisbon's architecture, Zurich's investors, the subtle signals of promotion. He would have unlocked the apartment door, expecting familiarity. Instead, he opened into stillness. Later, he told me what he noticed first. Not the envelope, the closet. He said he walked into the bedroom, dropped his suitcase and froze. My side, emptied with surgical precision. Hangers bare, the shoe rack is half vacant, jewelry tray gone. He thought at first that I had reorganized. That explanation lasted seconds. Then he saw the bathroom cabinet. My skincare is missing. My toothbrush is absent. He walked back into the kitchen. The envelope waited. He opened it standing up. He read it once, then again. The call came 12 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail, not to punish him, because the first reaction to shock is rarely clarity. He called again and again. Then the messages began. Meadow, what is this? Is this some kind of misunderstanding? Call me, please. There was no anger in the first hour, only confusion. The following day, the tone shifted. I don't understand how you could do this without talking to me. After everything? Is this about something specific? I listened to the voicemails in my new apartment, sunlight moving slowly across unfamiliar walls. I noticed something quietly significant. None of his messages asked, "Are you okay?" They asked what happened to him. Shock has stages. By midweek, the panic surfaced. He emailed my attorney directly. He requested an urgent conversation. He mentioned reconciliation, counselling, adjustments. Loss, when unexpected, destabilizes even the confident. Friends began texting me cautiously. Is everything okay? Daniel seems blindsided. Blindsided. That word circulated, as if clarity delivered quietly is somehow unfair. I responded to friends with restraint. I needed something dear. No accusations, no disclosures. Meanwhile, Daniel remained in the apartment that no longer felt stable. The physical absence became emotional weight. My half of the closet wasn't just empty space, it was evidence of an assumption shattered. He later admitted that the silence unnerved him more than any argument could have. I didn't even know you were unhappy, he said in a message. That was true, because I wasn't loudly unhappy. I was quietly misaligned. Consequences rarely begin with anger. They begin with realization. He began retracing conversations in his mind. Comments, dismissals, assumptions. But by then the structure had shifted. The paperwork was filed, the separation official. I had not disappeared impulsively. I had exited deliberately. And the weight of that deliberateness was heavier than rage. For the first time in our marriage, Daniel had to sit with uncertainty he could not smooth over. No dinner to reset the mood, no calm wife to regulate the tone, no steady presence to reassure him. The backbone had stepped away. And suddenly, he felt the absence of support he had mistaken for permanence. Consequences don't announce themselves loudly. They arrive as quiet rooms and empty closets. Panic doesn't arrive all at once. It builds in waves. The first week after Daniel returned home was confusion. The second was urgency. By the third, it was clear he understood something fundamental. This was not a temporary reaction. He sent a long email, not defensive, not accusatory. Detailed. He listed memories. Our first apartment, the road trip down the California coast, the night we stayed up assembling furniture on the living room floor. He wrote about how proud he was of me, how much he relied on me, how stable I made his life. And then the sentence that revealed everything. I didn't think you were capable of walking away. Capable. I read it twice. He didn't think I was capable. Not strong enough, not brave enough, not independent enough, or simply not willing enough to disrupt him. He requested a meeting. In person, neutral location, no lawyers present. I agreed. Not to reconsider, to close properly. When we met at a quiet cafe downtown, he looked different. Tired, less certain. The confidence that once filled rooms had narrowed into something smaller. I would have fixed it, he said almost immediately, if I had known. That sentence carries a particular weight. If I had known. I held his gaze. You did know, I said calmly. You just didn't believe it mattered. Silence settled between us. He began apologizing, not theatrically, but earnestly. He acknowledged the comments, the assumptions. The relocations were discussed without me. The future was mapped in his voice alone. I thought we were fine, he said. You never said you were this unhappy. I wasn't unhappy in a loud way, I replied. I was misaligned. He leaned forward, desperation edging into his voice. We can realign. We can start over. I'll change how we make decisions. I'll involve you in everything. There it was, the offer of reform. But something had shifted irreversibly inside me. Change offered under threat of loss is reactive. It is fear-driven. What I needed wasn't reactive inclusion. It was an intrinsic partnership. You're responding to the consequence, I said gently. Not the pattern. He went quiet. For the first time, I saw him confronting something he could not negotiate with charm or strategy. I underestimated you, he admitted. Yes, I said. Not bitterly, factually. He reached for my hand across the table. I didn't pull away immediately. I allowed the contact, acknowledging history without surrendering clarity. Come home, he said softly. Home. The word no longer fits. I am home, I answered. And I was. My new apartment was smaller, simpler, but it was aligned with who I had become, not who I had accommodated. He asked if there was anything he could do. There are moments in life where the answer is truly no. Not because forgiveness is impossible, but because identity has already shifted. You can learn from it, I said. For yourself. That was the last time we spoke without attorneys present. Regret is heavy, but it does not reverse structural decisions. By the time he understood the depth of the imbalance, I had already stepped outside of it. Too late to fix it doesn't mean too late to grow. It simply means growth will no longer happen together. He once believed I would never leave. Now he understood something else. I had never needed permission. I had needed alignment. And once I found it, there was no returning to who I used to be. The final legal meeting took place in a conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. Neutral ground, 2 attorneys, a polished wooden table, documents aligned in careful stacks. Daniel arrived early. I could tell by the way he was already seated when I walked in. Hands clasped, posture composed but strained. The version of him who once filled rooms with effortless confidence had narrowed into something quieter. Not broken, but recalibrated. We nodded at each other. No hostility, no dramatic pause, just acknowledgement. The lawyers discussed terms, asset division, timeline, administrative details. Everything was orderly because I had ensured it would be. Contributions documented, accounts transparent, no hidden maneuvers, no surprises. Daniel listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was measured. That allocation makes sense, he said at one point. She handled most of that portfolio. She. Not dismissive, not possessive. Accurate. There was a moment when the attorney stepped out briefly to finalize copies. The room softened into quiet. Daniel looked at me. I keep replaying everything, he said. trying to find the exact moment you decided. I considered the question carefully. There wasn't one moment, I replied. There was an accumulation. He nodded slowly. I thought confidence meant security, he said. I didn't realize it could become an assumption. That was the closest he had come to articulating the truth. Assumption is subtle. It doesn't feel like disrespect when you're the one benefiting from it. I never meant to make you feel small, he added. I know, I said. And I did. This wasn't a marriage defined by cruelty. It was defined by an imbalance left unexamined. That's what makes quiet departures so disorienting. There was no villain to point at, no explosive betrayal to anchor the narrative. Just two people who built a system that favored one more than the other and never paused to question it until it collapsed. The attorneys returned. Papers were signed. When I picked up the pen, my hand was steady. Not triumphant. Not grieving. Resolved. Daniel signed after me. The scratch of ink on paper sounded louder than it should have. When it was finished, the room felt lighter, not happier, but clearer. As we gathered our things, he spoke once more. I underestimated your strength, he said. Yes, I answered gently. You did. There was no edge in my voice, no satisfaction, just a fact. He hesitated, then asked, Are you happier? The question wasn't defensive, it was vulnerable. I paused before answering. I'm aligned, I said. Happiness fluctuates. Alignment endures. He nodded, absorbing that. We walked out of the building together, but not side by side. A few steps apart. Not dramatically distant, just no longer synchronized. Outside, the air was crisp. Seattle is grey, but open. He looked as if he wanted to say something more. Perhaps an apology that went deeper. Perhaps a memory. Instead, he said, Take care of yourself. I will, I replied. There was no raised voice, no closing argument. Confrontation without heat is unsettling, because it offers no emotional discharge, no catharsis. Just consequence. As I walked toward my car, I didn't feel victorious. I felt intact. He had expected noise. What he encountered instead was certainty. And certainty doesn't shout. It signs. It leaves. And it does not look back in anger, only in understanding. It has been a year since I moved out while he was on vacation. The apartment I live in now is still smaller than the one we shared, but it feels expansive in a different way. The light here moves differently. It reaches corners that used to feel dim inside me. I wake up without anticipating someone else's mood. That alone changed more than I expected. My freelance business is no longer part-time. I completed the certification course I once postponed. I took on larger contracts. I negotiated without apologizing for my rates. I expanded because I chose to, not because someone needed me to stay small for stability. There's a particular confidence that comes from self-authorship. Not rebellion, authorship. For the first time, my calendar reflects my priorities first. Travel, when I choose it, centers my curiosity, my learning, my pace. I've had evenings where I sit by the window with tea and silence, and the silence no longer feels like absence. It feels like ownership. Daniel and I finalized everything respectfully. There were no public disputes, no dramatic social media narratives. When mutual friends ask, I keep it simple. We wanted different structures. That's true. I don't speak poorly of him. There's no need, and he wasn't a villain. He was comfortable, and I was complicit in that comfort for years. Growth doesn't require bitterness. It requires honesty. Sometimes people ask if I regret not trying harder to fix it. I think about that carefully every time. The truth is, I did try. Quietly. For years, I adjusted, I accommodated, I softened the edges, I translated my needs into smaller versions so they would be easier to accept. What I stopped doing was negotiating with myself. There's a version of me that would have stayed indefinitely. She would have continued being the calm stabilizer, the reliable backbone, the woman who made everything smoother. She wasn't weak. She was strategic in survival. But survival is not the same as fulfillment. Now, when someone says, you're so steady, I smile differently. Steady no longer means permanent. It means grounded in choice. I no longer measure my value by how well I absorb. I measure it by how clearly I align. There's a quiet power in knowing you can leave respectfully. Not because you want to hurt someone, but because you refuse to disappear. My husband said I'd never leave. He was wrong. Not because I became impulsive, but because I became clear. And clarity is difficult to attain. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. The strongest version of yourself may not be loud. She may not shout or demand or dramatize. She may simply decide. And once she decides, she moves. Calmly. Intentionally. Without spectacle. I am not angrier now. I am not colder. I am simply defined by my own hand. And that feels like peace. When people hear my story, they often look for a dramatic turning point. A betrayal, a secret, a final explosive fight. There wasn't one. My husband said I'd never leave. I moved out while he was on vacation. And he came home to an empty closet and a lawyer's letter. But the real story isn't about the letter. It's about the years before it. The small comments sounded harmless. The decisions made on my behalf. The future drafted without my voice. It's about how easy it is to become indispensable and invisible at the same time. I didn't leave because he was cruel. I left because I disappeared. And the most dangerous kind of disappearance is the one that happens quietly, while everyone insists you're lucky and stable and easy. There is a difference between being patient and being permanent. There is a difference between being supportive and being sidelined. And there is a difference between peace and silence. I chose not to explode. I chose not to humiliate. I chose not to drag our private life into a public spectacle. I chose clarity. That is what quiet dominance really is. Not control, not revenge, not punishment. Just the refusal to continue participating in a structure that erases you. Leaving did not make me heartless. It made me honest. And honesty, when acted upon, changes everything. If you are watching this and recognizing yourself in the steady role, if you are the one who keeps things running while someone else receives the spotlight, I hope you ask yourself a gentle question tonight. Are you aligned? Not temporarily comfortable, not fine. Aligned, because alignment doesn't always require leaving. Sometimes it requires speaking sooner, but sometimes, it requires walking away without noise. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated to the point where people mistook your patience for permanence? And if you found your clarity, what did you do with it?
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye!